I've reached 100 episodes of this podcast, I thought I would spend some time this week thinking about all the advice that I seem to give out on repeat. What are the things I say every week to many different clients and in various different Instagram posts? If you've been hearing most of my episodes, you might be familiar with some of these phrases I'm going to focus on, and they apply to you whatever kind of digestive issues you have, because today is all about the way you approach food and your digestion rather than working on any particular symptom or diet. Hello and welcome to episode 100 of the Inside Knowledge podcast for people with IBS. I'm Anna Mapson. I really never thought that I would get to 100 episodes without taking a break. I mean, I have had a few breaks when I've been on holiday or over Christmas or something, but I really have kept this going. I thought I might just start off with one season, but I have kept going and pretty much every week for 100 episodes. So I'm pretty proud of that actually, because I didn't think I was going to be able to fit it into my busy life. I'm also writing a book at the moment, and you might hear more about that this coming year. I want to, by the end of 2025, have my book ready to publish. And there's quite a lot of work that goes into that. So I have thought about taking a little pause on the podcast, but I've still got so many ideas and things to share with you. So I don't really want to take too much of a break. But I am really excited about the book, and I will share more with you when I'm ready to. But it's going to be about everything you're used to hearing in this podcast, all my normal topics. So I will share more on that when I'm ready. But yeah, back to today's topic, which is going to be things that I say on repeat. I started the idea for this podcast thinking about a social media post, talking about things I say every week to my IBS clients. And then I thought, actually, it'll be a good episode to chat through some of these in a podcast. So I've got 5 things that I normally say pretty regularly to my clients. And the first one I'm going to start with is, could there have been anything else that triggered your reaction? So the context of me saying this to people is normally when they say they've been doing okay, then they have a flare up, or perhaps they're telling me, oh, I can't eat onions. Like, onions are always my trigger. What I like to do is to try and explore a little bit. Could there have been other things that created this reaction that weren't just the food that you immediately assume it is going to be? The reason for getting behind some of the data is sometimes we find out that actually core things that are triggering your symptoms could be lack of sleep, high alcohol intake, stress, skipping meals. Like, a lot of these things will also add to your digestive issues and are not only down to the food that you're eating. The reason for trying to stop you eliminating more and more foods is that many people I work with have already cut out a lot of foods and they're already quite restricted. And so what I don't want to do is to immediately assume that something that you ate created a flare-up, therefore we need to cut that food out. So it's good to explore what other things might be part of your triggers. So the reason sleep can be a real trigger is that sometimes you feel a lot more pain, you feel a lot more anxiety when you haven't slept well, just generally feel a lot less resilient. And it can also affect food choices. So when we're really tired, we tend to crave sugary, carb-rich foods, and sometimes those in themselves are a trigger. And then you have something else that adds to that meal or that pattern of eating, and that can sometimes be the trigger, not necessarily the particular food. Now, the other thing I find really interesting is sometimes people will have a mixed meal. I mean, generally we don't just eat one thing for dinner. You have a meal of all sorts of different foods, and a lot of clients will just assume it was the one thing that they're not sure about, without going into whether it could be a combination of foods. Like, if you know about FODMAP stacking, you can sometimes find that you're eating more highly fermentable foods in a meal than you previously thought. So sometimes it's a combination of foods. So yeah, anyway, I'm not going to go into it too much, but one of the things I say a lot is, could there have been anything else? And so for you at home, part of the action or the thing that you could consider is, next time you have a flare up, thinking about, could you find any other causes for this other than a particular food that you're now looking to remove from your diet? Alcohol is also a really big one that I find people very loath to blame their digestive issues on. If you've had too much to drink one night, whether it's a little extra glass of wine on a Friday night, or you went out with some friends, had some cocktails, any amount of alcohol can upset your digestion, and it can last for 2 to 3 days. It's not just when you're feeling a bit hungover the next morning. It can really last and really upset your system. So that is a background trigger that I think people will easily forget about. Maybe you went out on Friday night, on Sunday, maybe even Monday, you're still feeling a bit dodgy. That can be down to the disruption caused by the alcohol. Anyway, so that was the first thing. Is there anything else that could have triggered your reaction? Is it the food that you just ate? Remember as well that not only the food that you've just eaten could be your trigger, it could be something else that you ate yesterday that is now moving to the large intestine, the last part of your digestive system, and that's what's giving you excessive gas, for example. I'm going to move on now to the second phrase that I say a lot, which is you can feel like you're eating enough food and you still need to eat more. Now, this is often the case for people who have either been very restrictive or they're thinking about weight loss in their mind and trying to control the amount of food that they're eating for whatever reason, whether they're trying to lose weight or whether they're trying to cut out any potential triggers. You can feel that, yeah, I'm eating enough, or I'm eating more than I used to, and it's still not enough. So those two things can coexist. You can feel like it's not enough, and it can physically be not enough protein, not enough fiber, not enough overall calories for a person of your size and your health goals. So this is also something that I say more regularly than I used to. I do find that people will be under eating because of their digestive symptoms. And if you think about the episode that I did about RFID and IBS, there is a big crossover between people who are afraid of the digestive consequences of eating and so have cut out so many foods that they are losing weight and maybe low in key nutrients. It's more common than you might think. So really important to think about, just because you feel like you're eating enough, is it enough? So the reason it's so important to eat more is that when you don't eat enough, you can get constipation, you can be bloated, you can have low stomach acid. You know, people want to sometimes think about doing things the natural way as well, rather than potentially taking laxatives for constipation. But you know what? There's nothing natural about under eating to the extent that your digestion has slowed down. That's also not natural. And so we have to look at what are the causes for some of the symptoms. And sometimes it is down to under eating. Obviously, this is not going to apply to everybody, but I do say that quite frequently. Now, the third thing I often say to my clients is, if your symptoms are the same whether you eat this food or not, you may as well be eating it. Now, this is really common in the cases of people doing the FODMAP diet. So a lot of people will come to work with me and they have been low FODMAP for a number of months or maybe even years. They have probably followed the low FODMAP diet and chosen to exclude onions, garlic, chickpeas, maybe dairy, maybe gluten, a whole range of different fruits and vegetables because they worry that these foods are causing their digestive issues. But they normally come to see me because their digestive issues are still present. So they are still getting the problems whether they eat those foods or not. And part of the reintroduction is to test whether you actually have a problem with these or not. And that is something I spend a lot of time talking to people about, is how to bringing the foods back in again in a careful way so that we can actually test it and we can check whether you do have an issue with it or not. But more generally, if you don't have a problem with gluten, for example, and wheat containing foods, then there is no reason to exclude that food from your diet. The same with onions and garlic. People say, oh, but I've heard it's bad for people with IBS to eat these foods, so I think I should avoid them. But actually, if they're not causing your symptoms, you may as well be eating them. There's no reason that people who have IBS should all be following a low FODMAP diet. In fact, you definitely shouldn't. It's a dietary intervention that you just follow for 2 to 6 weeks, and then you spend time reintroducing the foods. So the most common times I will say this, that if you're getting the symptoms, whether you eat this food or not, you may as well eat it. Most of the time is during the FODMAP reintroduction process. And if people don't get a reaction to a FODMAP group, for example, fructose, if you're okay with all fructose containing foods, then you may as well be eating them. They're so good for you. Lots of healthy foods in there. Fruits, tomatoes, red pepper. These are great foods, lots of antioxidants. So we don't want to exclude them just because they happen to be in the low FODMAP diet profile. The same kind of thing with fiber. People often are quite worried about increasing their fiber intake, but actually it can be very helpful for people with IBS. And if you get on okay with it, then you should be eating a higher fiber diet if you can tolerate it. So obviously, sometimes it's not a good idea, and you may eat something that does give you a flare-up. So we don't want to keep on pushing that. It's all about symptom management. But I think a lot of people I work with have a concern that certain foods are bad for IBS, or certain foods just shouldn't be eaten, even if you don't have a direct problem with them. All right, moving on to the next area. The fourth thing that I say quite often to my clients is, just because some health information is online or some people get on okay with certain diets does not mean that it will be okay for you. And this is because we're all so individual. Obviously, we have different digestive triggers, different issues, different genetics, different gut microbiome. And that all means that some people do get on well with one meal a day. Some people do get on well with the carnivore diet. But it doesn't necessarily mean that these are things that you should do. When people have been researching a lot, and when you've had a really difficult time with your doctor, you don't feel like you've been listened to, you don't feel like people are taking you seriously, then you can easily go down a rabbit hole of online information. You get into a Facebook group where people are sharing their knowledge and their suggestions for how to get better. Maybe you start listening to a lot of podcasts or reading blog posts. That is really normal, where you're trying to solve this for yourself because you don't feel like anyone has supported you. And so you're looking for help yourself. That's really understandable. But what is really tricky is that sometimes the advice that is online is very specific or is very persuasive as well as the other thing. I often find it will fall into two camps. One is somebody tried something and it made them better. So they shout about it from the rooftops, and they are a case study of one, not a research study, not like lots of clinical expertise. They are just their happy, amazing story. So they're promoting, you have to go low fiber, or you have to take this particular supplement, or this way of eating cures people. So that's one thing. The other is people who are just generally wedded to a way of eating. This is particularly on like the low carb tribe. So people who think sugar is evil, sugar is at the root of all the problems in the nutrition space. We should all be eating high fat and protein and no carbohydrates at all. This is almost like a real cult in some ways. So, for example, people will have that sort of view of the world, and then every problem, every issue that you could have will relate back to high glucose levels, or, you're not eating enough fat. So those kind of camps where people are either promoting something that's really helped them as an individual, or people who are so wedded to a certain way of eating that everything always goes back to the same solution, you just have to be a bit careful of, because it doesn't necessarily mean it will suit you. And remember, if you're someone who's following that kind of advice and you're still not in a good way, then maybe it's not working for you. So an example of this is somebody I was speaking to recently who only eats one meal a day. And I've said, I don't think this is a healthy approach for your digestion, because you are cutting out a lot of opportunity to get the gut moving. You're restricting the gastrocolic reflex, which is the thing that moves the food along through the gut. You're also putting all of your nutrition targets into one meal a day, and you cannot really healthily meet all your protein targets, your fiber targets, your vitamin C, calcium, iron. Like, it's really hard to meet all of those targets in one meal a day. So this person said, yeah, but online I see people doing it and they're fine. And what is worth taking into account then is just thinking, well, am I fine? Am I fine with this approach? Am I getting on well? Am I healthy? Am I thriving? Or actually, am I in a really bad place? So just because stuff is online doesn't mean it applies to you. The other thing is, it doesn't necessarily mean it's true as well. So I posted something recently online about low stomach acid does not cause acid reflux. And you can go back and listen to episode 61. I think I did about PPIs, and another one about acid reflux, where I talked about this. But there is no evidence for low stomach acid causing reflux. However, you will see this hundreds of times on the internet. You will see it on social media posts, in blog posts. People say it as if it's some kind of common knowledge, but there's actually no evidence that it does create reflux. So you have to, again, be careful about what is sometimes like the social media myths. And that is going to lead me on to the fifth area that I wanted to talk about, which is about foods being classed as inflammatory or toxic. So you've probably heard me talk about this quite a bit before. It really riles me up when people talk about gluten being inflammatory, dairy being inflammatory, because it isn't. And most people can get on and have healthy portions of these foods in their diet with no effect. Now, if you're in the place where you're feeling, yeah, but I'm not in a good place and I'm looking for the solution, it can be really easy to just cut out the things that people say are bad the most often. So you want to remove them from your diet to be safe, to be sure that they're not triggering you. Now, the problem is that the more you cut out and the more you listen to these kind of messages where people are telling you chemicals are bad, which doesn't even make sense anyway, because chemicals are everywhere. I know they're talking about artificial, like man-made products that are added to food, like stabilizers and emulsifiers and things like that. But even so, just saying chemicals are bad for you is not particularly helpful, I don't think. But then when we're talking about food that actually is normal, healthy food, and we're calling it toxic, we're calling it inflammatory, it's setting you up for a really bad relationship with food, that it's overly scary. And yes, there is an element to which food can trigger your digestive issues when you've got SIBO, when you've got IBS. Of course, what you eat has a big part to play in it. But there's also the microbial side of things. You know, we've talked quite a lot on the podcast about SIBO, about gut bacteria and what they do and how you can manipulate them. So there's a microbial side to things. There's also the gut-brain connection. You know, often IBS is described as a disorder of the gut-brain connection. And it is not just down to what you eat. It is down to how you're feeling, how you're processing life. It's so much bigger than just cutting foods out. So when we talk about foods being kind of bad for you or not clean, like clean eating, opposite of that is not clean, doesn't sound very good. You know, it's putting a little bit of moral judgment into it, but also it's making you maybe a bit more obsessed with food and avoiding things rather than looking at what you can add in. My approach is much more to be adding in good stuff rather than trying to take more foods away, because it leads to a nicer, freer mindset around eating. But also it just gives you a lot more goodness, rather, adding in rather than thinking about restricting and taking away all the time. It's just a very difficult mindset to be in. All right, so I realise this episode may have been a little bit more waffly and a little bit more unstructured than some of my other episodes, but I just wanted to take the chance, I guess, to be a bit more unstructured and a bit freer with what I'm chatting about, because I'm celebrating 100 episodes. So I hope you've enjoyed it and you've got something out of it. I'm going to ask again, if you haven't yet, please rate and review my podcast. It really does make a difference to me. And if you enjoy listening to it, I would really appreciate it if you would go into the podcast app, whatever you're listening on, and rate it with a good rating. Thank you. I'm going to leave it there. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Inside Knowledge podcast. Better digestion for everyone.